This move, 1, e4, immediately stakes a claim in the center, opening diagonals for the queen and bishop, and preparing for rapid piece development, setting the stage for many common opening systems. This symmetrical response immediately establishes central pawn control and opens lines for both bishops and the queen, setting the stage for classic open game theory. This move develops a knight to a central square, attacking black's e5 pawn and preparing for kingside castling, a standard and aggressive response in many open games. This move develops a knight to a natural square, defending the central e5 pawn and preparing for further piece development and control of key central squares. This move, d4, immediately challenges the center and opens lines, which is a core principle in many openings like the Scotch game. Black accepts the pawn sacrifice, entering the well-established Scotch game, where white typically gains a central pawn majority and active piece play in return for the gambited pawn. This move initiates the Scotch game, immediately challenging black's central pawn and opening lines for white's pieces. This move, 4, bc5, is a solid and active response in the Scotch game, directly challenging white's central pawn and preparing to castle kingside. This aggressive knight sortie initiates a thematic gambit by creating immediate threats against black's vulnerable f7 pawn and developing a strong initiative. This move develops the queen to a more active square, preparing to contest the knight on f5 and potentially challenge white's central pawn structure. This move develops the knight to a more active central square, reinforcing the e4 pawn and preparing to castle. Developing the knight to e7 supports the d4 pawn, prepares to castle queenside, and aims to reinforce the kingside defense later in the game. This move neatly prepares for potential castling kingside while reinforcing the center and offering a safe retreat square for the knight if black's bishop attacks it. Castling kingside secures the monarch and activates a rook, a standard defensive and developmental maneuver in this open Italian game variation. This move prepares to fianchetto the bishop to g2, reinforcing the kingside and controlling the long diagonal. This move aims to develop the knight to a more active square, controlling central squares and preparing to challenge white's knight on f3. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to dislodge the knight on e5, opening lines for white's pieces while creating weaknesses around black's king. This move repositions the knight to a more active square where it can potentially challenge white's central control and prepare to join the kingside attack. This move develops the bishop to a long-range diagonal, supporting the central pawn push and preparing to castle, which is a key developing move. This move reinforces the d5 square, preparing to challenge white's central pawn majority and potentially open lines for black's pieces. In the center, white castles kingside to connect the rooks and secure the king, initiating a common plan in this type of Italian game variation to control the center and prepare for pawn advances on the kingside. This pawn thrust challenges white's central control, aiming to open lines for black's pieces and create dynamic counterplay after the likely recapture. This move prepares to reposition the king, potentially to h2, which clears the g1 square for a piece and also enhances king safety behind the pawn chain. Black captures the knight, disrupting white's center and potentially opening lines for their queen and rooks. This exchange simplifies the position by removing central tension, and white's bishop on e3 now eyes the weakened dark squares around black's king. This move opens the d-file and prepares to challenge white's central pawn majority while also developing the queen to a more active square. The queen repositions to c1, a prudent move to evade immediate threats and prepare for potential attacks down the c-file or on the kingside, while also supporting the knight's potential advance. Developing the bishop to an active diagonal after recapturing the pawn offers better control of central squares and prepares for potential kingside pressure or a queenside counterplay. This move recaptures the pawn and prepares to challenge black's central control, opening up lines for white's pieces while forcing black to address the immediate threat. By capturing the knight, black initiates a simplification that trades off white's active piece and opens the e-file for potential future activity. This recapture on e4 solidifies white's central pawn presence and opens the b1h7 diagonal for the queen, preparing to challenge black's kingside defenses. This move aims to activate the rook on the f-file and connect the remaining heavy pieces, preparing for potential pawn advances and piece exchanges that align with black's strategic goals. In this gambit-like pawn structure, this rook move redeploys to an open file, increasing pressure on black's central pawn and preparing to contest the e-file for potential tactical opportunities. This move develops the queenside rook to a more active square, challenging white's control of the open e-file and preparing potential queenside expansion. This move solidifies the queenside pawn structure, prepares to challenge black's centralized d5 pawn, and opens a line for the rook to potentially support the central advance. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, attacking the white queen and preparing to contest central control. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, anticipating a potential queenside expansion and supporting the knight on f5. This move initiates a pawn storm on the kingside, aiming to exploit the space advantage and potentially open lines for your pieces against white's castled king. This move repositions the queen to coordinate with the rook on the e-file and the weakened light squares around black's king, potentially preparing for a queenside pawn advance. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to control central squares and potentially support a future kingside attack or central pawn break. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to contest the long diagonal and prepare for potential advances on the kingside. This move continues black's plan to create space on the kingside and prepare for the advancement of the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay. This move prepares to activate the rook by potentially creating an open file on the e-file, putting pressure on black's central pawn structure and potentially forcing concessions. The move 22, nd5 repositions the knight to a more active central square, challenging white's pieces and preparing to support potential pawn advances or tactical operations. On the kingside, the rook now occupies the open e-file, increasing pressure on black's king and preparing to coordinate with the other rook for a powerful central attack. The move exchanges rooks, simplifying the position and allowing black to consolidate its pieces while challenging white's control of the open e-file. By exchanging the rooks on the e-file, white simplifies the position and prepares to contest the open file with a rook and queen, aiming to increase pressure on black's kingside. This move repositions the knight to a more passive square, potentially preparing to reroute it to f5 or g6 to support the kingside pawn advance. This move is a strong pawn push to gain space on the queenside and challenge black's pawn structure, potentially opening lines for the rook on c1. Black retreats the knight to a more passive square, allowing white to solidify their central pawn majority and prepare a further advance. This move eyes the weak c6 pawn and forces black to commit to defending it. disrupting white's potential piece activity and aiming to create imbalances. This aggressive pawn push aims to disrupt white's pawn structure on the kingside and potentially open lines for black's rook and queen to attack the white king. This move prepares to advance the queen to the queenside, aiming to exploit white's slightly uncoordinated pieces and potentially create threats against black's kingside pawn structure. This move ((na6) is a positional concession, allowing white's ((c4) pawn to become more influential and potentially creating an outpost for white's knight on ((d5) if the pawn structure shifts. The capture on h5 removes a key defender of black's kingside, opening lines for attack and creating immediate threats against the weakened pawn structure. This move intends to control the d-file and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, aiming to create play against white's less developed kingside pieces. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, supporting a potential pawn advance on the kingside and preparing to contest the open d-file should black's pieces become disorganized. This pawn capture disrupts white's pawn chain and opens lines towards the king, creating tactical opportunities but also potentially weakening black's own king safety if not handled precisely. This move 30. Qf3 is a proactive attempt to exploit the open files and weak squares around black's king, aiming to create attacking opportunities by coordinating with the rook on the f-file and potentially opening lines for a direct assault. The move seeks to activate the king, centralize it, and prepare for potential complications or a defensive stance against white's aggressive pawn push on the kingside. This move centralizes the queen, preparing to attack the weakened kingside and potentially support a pawn advance while keeping an eye on black's knight. This pawn sacrifice is an aggressive attempt to break open the kingside and exploit the exposed white king, aiming to create attacking chances by opening files. This pawn capture opens up the h-file, creating potential attacking lines for your rook and king into black's position. This move opens up the queen to attack the kingside and prepares to challenge white's attacking structure by aiming towards the g-file. This move intensifies the attack on black's king, aiming to open lines for white's remaining pieces and exploit the vulnerable kingside pawn structure. This forcing check on the king is a desperate attempt to disrupt white's mating attack and create counterplay, but it unfortunately walks into a forced checkmate sequence. This move is a strategic retreat to preserve the king after the check, aiming to consolidate the defense and prepare for potential counterplay or regrouping. Black aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and attack the exposed king by activating the knight on g6 and preparing to move the rook to the open file. This move sacrifices the bishop to eliminate black's powerful knight on g6, opening lines for white's queen and rook and disrupting black's defensive structure. With the black king now exposed after the dramatic exchange on g6, this move recaptures the pawn and centralizes the queen, offering some immediate relief while potentially setting up defensive structures. This pawn push aims to disrupt black's queen and knight coordination and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, while also restricting the mobility of black's pieces. This pawn move aims to disrupt white's central control and create potential counterplay on the queenside by opening the b-file for the rook. The timely check forces the black king into a less secure position and begins the decisive attack by opening lines towards the king. The king must retreat to safety behind the pawns on a dark square, or risk further immediate checks along the open files and diagonals. This move centralizes the queen on a strong outpost, attacking the loose knight on g6 and preparing to exert pressure along the f-file or support a potential d5-d6 pawn push. This move desperately attempts to disrupt white's strong central pawn structure and centralize the rook to a more active post. This move is a proactive attempt to improve white's queen's mobility and coordinate it with the rooks, aiming to create attacking chances on the queenside and potentially exploit the open c-file if the pawns advance. This move prepares to recapture the pawn on c5 by bringing the queen into an attacking position, aiming to exploit white's vulnerable pawn structure. White's move 40. Ca3 aims to create threats against the black king by repositioning the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a discovered attack or reinforcing attacks on the kingside. This move attempts to create immediate threats against white's king by attacking the weak f2 pawn and opening lines for the black pieces. But it overlooks the tactical opportunity for white to eliminate the attacking rook with a well-placed queen sacrifice and checkmate. This move sacrifices the queen to force checkmate through a series of forcing checks. A classic demonstration of mating patterns with a queen and rook against a lone king. The king is forced to remain active, seeking shelter on the kingside while desperately trying to avoid further checks and potential mating nets. This move aims to activate the bishop to a more aggressive square on the kingside, preparing for potential attacks and reinforcing the central control. This move aims to activate the rook on the f-file, potentially creating threats against white's king and pieces, while also preparing to support a further pawn push or to defend critical squares. This move, rf2, aims to redeploy the rook to a more active square, likely supporting a kingside attack or preparing to challenge white's control of the f-file after black's rook capture. The move 43, k4+, is a desperate attempt to create counterplay by forcing a queen exchange and hoping to exploit the exposed white king. But it overlooks white's strong defensive setup and the incoming rook check, which will lead to a swift conclusion. This move is a defensive necessity to prevent the black rook and queen from creating immediate mating threats along the open d-file and diagonal. This move intends to create a strong central outpost for the knight on d4, threatening the white queen and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. This rook sacrifice on f5 is a decisive tactic, forcing a queen exchange that leads to a winning material advantage and a protected passed pawn for white. This forcing capture aims to eliminate a key defender and simplify the position, hoping to reach a favorable endgame by trading material. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the kingside and preparing for potential exchanges or defensive maneuvers. This move initiates a strong tactical sequence, aiming to exploit the exposed white king and potentially create a mating net or force material. Concessions. The white king moves to g1. A prophylactic maneuver to escape the open diagonal and potential checks along the d-file, preparing to consolidate material advantage. This check forces the white king to a more exposed square, allowing black to maintain the initiative and continue the pursuit of mating threats after the king relocates. This move repositions the king to the corner, aiming to escape the checks and potentially prepare for a counterplay or defense by bringing other pieces into the game more actively. This move brings the queen to a more active central square, potentially preparing to exploit the exposed black king and create threats along the g-file or target weak pawns. The king retreats to safety, avoiding the immediate checks and preparing to defend the d4 pawn and potentially support a king side counterplay. This knight sacrifice is a desperate but brilliant attempt to disrupt white's king safety by creating mating threats and forcing concessions. The king retreats to g2 to escape the immediate check and prepare for further defense. Although the material disadvantage and exposed king position present significant challenges. This move, nd2, is a bold attempt to penetrate white's defenses and exploit the weakened kingside after the pawn sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's coordination and create threats against the king.